Well, there are more than 7 billion of us now, and the distribution of resources is key. It must also be done in a way which doesn't cause too much damage to the planet. Well, a reminder now of my guest tonight. Mehdi Idrissi is Paris Bureau Chief for the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN. On my left, Jan Wielander is an economist on the Africa desk at the OECD Development Centre. Christophe Guillemotteau is a senior fellow in demography at the Research Institute for Development. And in Vermont tonight, Dr. Stephen Sinding is the former Director General at the International Planned Parenthood Federation. He's also the co-author of the book Population Matters. Well, we'll hear a bit more from my guests in a moment. First, though, let's take a look at this report on the mounting challenges to the world's food production system.
Waste not, want not is a piece of advice which is being ignored by most of the world's population. In the West, it's estimated that more than a third of all food ends up in the bin. And that figure is about the same in poorer nations, but for a different reason. Here, food is more likely to go off before it's eaten because the costs of storage and transport can be too high. With an ever-growing population, there are worries that such waste is unsustainable. But it's not the only factor making it more and more difficult to feed the world. In recent decades, technology has continued to help farmers get ever greater yields from their crops. But since around 1990, annual increases in crop yields have been growing more slowly than the world's population. With little land still uncultivated, even better technology will be needed to keep up. This is one of the reasons that food prices have spiked in recent years, with another being the global financial crisis. The effects of this have been easy to see. In 2008, there were widespread food riots, as many who were already close to the poverty line saw their cost of living go up sharply. The issue has become increasingly political, with France putting food security at the top of the G20 agenda this year. Nicolas Sarkozy places some of the blame for high food prices on traders who speculate on agricultural commodities.
Financial speculation around these underlying agricultural assets, even though it doesn't explain everything, has greatly contributed to the volatility of prices. I want us to remember that a market that is not regulated is not a market, it's a lottery.
Despite all of these concerns, some comfort can be taken from the fact that people have been predicting we won't be able to feed ourselves for over 200 years. And for now at least, we've got more food than we need. The challenge is making sure it's shared so no one has to go hungry.
All right, let's find out what my guests think about that then. Jan Wielander, when people see this figure, 7 billion people, they see explosive population growth, that's the main fear, isn't it? That there simply isn't enough food to go around. But you say that's not something people should be worried about.
Well, not exactly. I think people should be worried about providing enough food for everybody on the planet. I think that's a very important
But they should worry that there's not enough for them.
Yeah. Well, what I think what we should see is population growth also as a boon and not only as a problem. Because we've just learned that we have seen declining fertility rates in many parts of the world. And we also do expect to see these in Africa at latest around 2050. So what we have here is what we call the demographic dividend, which is a window of opportunity in which your population will still grow, but then the growth will come down. So you will have a time where the working age population will grow while the dependent population will shrink. So you have a growing working age population, which really is the source of savings, which will then lead to economic growth, which is the source of savings that you can invest into the future generations that will be smaller generations. So this demographic dividend is very important. And we, for example, we have seen in East Asia, where many people speak of the East Asian miracle, some estimations say that about 1/4 of the East Asian economic miracle came from this demographic dividend. So it is a very important factor, and really the challenge is for Africa to make the most of this demographic dividend, of this window of opportunity that we have now of 30 years, where population will still grow, but then it'll grow not as fast anymore.
And do you think that could turn around the economic situation in Africa, of course, where some of the world's poorest countries are?
There are big challenges. I mean, to make most use of this demographic dividend means to heavily invest into education, to invest definitely in health, so that this will be a healthy population, a well-educated population. And then clearly food security is one of the very first concerns. But for example, what you can do about food security, which is investing into agriculture, would at the same time also bring would improve the labor markets in rural Africa, where many of today's poor live. And stronger labor markets are what you need to make use of this demographic dividend. So the solutions go together: education, investment into agriculture, stronger labor markets. So these all go together to make the most use of this demographic dividend.
All right, Mehdi Jusi, let's talk about food distribution, because the argument goes that there's plenty of food on the planet to feed everyone, but it's the way that it's handed out is unfair, and that means why, as you said, 1 million people currently at risk of starvation.
Yes, the problem is...
1 billion people, I'm sorry.
Yes, the problem is the distribution of resources, because of the distorted markets. Everything should be reviewed, starting by investing in agriculture and an effective coordination and decisions when it comes to investment, to the agricultural trade and the financial markets. Today, nothing of that is happening, and also we all see the lack of political will. The highest authorities in the world, have agreed in 2000 to reduce by half the number of people suffering from hunger to 400 million. And today we are close to 1 billion. Once again, no estimates for 2011, but we are...
What is in your view, what is the main problem? What is hindering food getting to people that need it the most?
It's not that the food should get to them. It's to help them produce their own food.
And why are they not able to do that?
Because of the lack of investment in when we talk about the official development assistance, but also on the national budgets of the countries of the south, the countries in the south, and then there's a long list of other reasons, as the biofuels, for instance, but also. We could mention the lack of transparency in the markets and the excessive speculation. So there's a long list of reasons why this is happening. And FAO came up with recommendations together with OECD at the request of the French presidency to the G20. And most of them are already taking place. And we hope that the next meeting in Cannes of the G20 will help those recommendations to really start being effective.
For example, the drought and the famine in Somalia and countries in that region, why wasn't that better anticipated, do you think?
That should have been prevented. Back in 2011, the FAO Director General, Dr. Jacques Diouf, has coordinated a task force at the request of the UN Secretary General by then, Dr. Kofi Annan, and the report showed what to do to prevent this from happening again, saying that the drought was affecting 99% of Somalia, and that projects should be implemented in irrigation and in rural infrastructures. Nothing has been done unless, although the project was submitted to all by FAO and its partners.
Now, waste is another big problem, isn't it? Because in industrialized countries, 222 billion tons of food are wasted annually. Why is that happening?
1.3 billion tons are, but there's a big difference between wastes and losses. What happens in the developed countries is waste, and there's not so much we can do about it. The most serious problem, in our opinion, is the losses in Africa because of the absence of storages. You have to know that African farmers, small farmers, are losing up to 50% of their crops because of the absence of storage. And what your viewers have seen before was clearly showing that. So it's more losses than wastes.
There's an argument that if everyone in the world was to turn vegetarian, there would be no hunger. Is there any truth to that? That's something that the animal rights campaigners say time and time again.
You know, the demand for food continues to rise faster than the supply. And when we talk about demand, it's more likely to be meat, especially in emerging countries like Brazil and India and others. So I don't think that the vegetarian thing you're talking about is likely to happen.
You don't agree with the vegetarian movement? Okay. Now, all of this is very, very dangerous, isn't it, for security and social unrest in these countries that are affected by hunger and also by rising food prices. And we saw that just a few years ago in 2008, didn't we? We saw a lot of riots. Do you think there's a risk that might happen again as food prices continue to rise?
Definitely, I think there always is a risk when food prices rise so high that people see their existence threatened, that people will go riot and will make themselves heard because their existence is at threat. But at the same time, we have seen food prices rise even now again, and we haven't seen the same extent of protests as we have seen in 2008. So I think that there is a chance of riots. But I think another point that's very important here to make when we talk about social unrest and the impact of population growth on social unrest is also to think about, to make use of this demographic dividend that I mentioned, it means we need to be able to provide employment for all these new people. So this also means that we need to focus on youth employment and youth unemployment as some very important factors that also are resulting out of this strong growth of the population. For example, estimates are that Africa needs to create between 7 and 10 million jobs every year to employ the new young people that join the labor market. And now if we think of what we've seen in Northern Africa, in Tunisia, in Egypt, certain extent in Libya, we've seen over the last years really that the youth unemployment rates have increased dramatically in Northern Africa. And a lot of people make the argument that that was part of the reasons for why people have chosen to make a revolution. So I think that's another critical link there between population growth and social cohesion that we need to be aware of, and to be able to provide employment is very important.
Is that a link you see as well, Christoph, this link between how societies change?
No, I agree with what you've said, and I would add that for this demographic dividends to really materialize, you need not only to find people jobs, but you have to find everyone jobs, because in part of the world I'm more familiar with in Asia, very few women work. So even if they are adults or well educated, they're not part of the workforce. So it's very important not only to provide employment, but also to encourage people to be part of this development.
And this is more of a challenge than ever, isn't it, with the way the economy is now? We're in one of the worst economic situations in nearly a century, so there is more pressing need than ever to get this done.
Yeah, but it's been forever. The problem of underinvestment in agriculture has been there since the 70s, and the Green Revolution in Asia that prevented Asia and South America from famine. We need to increase food production, agricultural production by 70% before 2050, and that is 100% in developing countries. There's no other solution.
I think another important point to make here on saying that now it's a difficult situation, we are in a financial crisis, it's hard to create employment. We also have to be aware of the fact that the center of this crisis really is the developed world, is Europe, is North America. Those are the countries most heavily affected. Whereas the emerging countries, the developing countries, are not at the center of this crisis. And they are really, right now, more the engines of the world economy, China and India with their growth. And also in Africa, we've seen over the last decade, on average, an economic growth of 5%, which is much higher than we have seen it at any time before in Africa. So there is not only crisis in the world, there is also good outlooks. It's just that the crisis is in our country, so that's really what we see. But there is, I think, a lot of opportunities in other parts of the world.
I see there's some optimism at the OECD. Let's go back to Dr. Sönig in the United States. The UN has said that we have to be prepared for population growth. We are looking at 10 billion people by the end of this century, if not before. When we talk about food resources and energy resources, do you think we are ready to cope with that?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. I tend to be somewhat more of an optimist when it comes to long-term projections. I think that the current UN projection of 10 billion is up a billion from where they were a couple of years ago, in part because they have seen significant declines in the rate at which population growth has been falling. But I think a renewed effort on the part of governments to provide the information and services that they once provided in the past could in fact considerably accelerate future fertility decline, so that I think an eventual stabilization at 9 billion is very much a possibility, and one that shouldn't be discounted. As far as feeding or educating or finding employment for that additional 2 or 3 billion people, it's an enormous challenge. There's no question about that. If we were 5.5 or 6 billion today rather than 7, which we could have done had we been somewhat more intelligent and committed to the programs that we began back in the 60s, the world certainly would be a better place today. I think that there would be less youth unemployment, there would be less hunger, there would be less destruction of natural resources, and I think that that those opportunities still lie before us, but each year it becomes more difficult. And there's no question in my mind that continuing to add 11 or 12 billion people to a billion people to the population every 12 or 13 years is placing enormous strains not only on food and economic and social systems, but on the natural systems of the planet. One of the things we haven't talked about, and which I hope in the few minutes that remain we might talk about, is global warming and the tremendous impact of human numbers on this very fragile ecosystem.
Absolutely, and I would indeed like to have more time to talk about that, but we are running out of time. So I just want to end quickly with you, Christoph, our demographer here in the studio. Where do you see world population growth going in 50 years? What do you think the world will look like in 50 years in terms of demographics?
Well, I'm afraid there's going to be a growing level of inequality between countries, and countries that are growing very fast now won't be very much better off after 50 years. So we have to help and support them, support their government, support our civil society organization to help people really control their fertility and reach reasonable levels of demographic growth.
All right, we're gonna have to end on a negative note then. Christoph Guillemotto, many thanks indeed. Mehdi Drissi, thank you to you. Jan Rielander, and in the US tonight, Stephen Seining, thank you very much indeed to you all for taking part in tonight's debate. And thanks to you, as always, for watching. I'll be back with you at the same time tomorrow with another debate. Until then, much more news and headlines coming up right here on France 24.